Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to ThePrint. I am Remya Nair. I have with me today Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairperson of the Planning Commission and someone who was very closely involved with the 1991 economic reforms. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. Sir, it's been nearly 3 decades since these reforms have come in. How do you think these reforms have actually made an impact on the Indian economy?
Well, 1991 was a very long time ago, as you said. I mean, it's not just 3 decades, but more than half the country wasn't born when the reforms happened. And it's not actually fair to sort of ask questions about today and look at what the impact of the reforms was, because the reforms, in my view, were very historic. They had a very important impact. And of course, the impact took a little bit time to show up because, the reforms were consciously introduced in what you would call a gradualist manner. Now, that was a concession, if you like, to the fact that this is a democratic country, and in a democracy, you have to kind of carry everyone with you. So generally, governments said we must do something, then they did a bit of it, left out some stuff, and so on. That's unavoidable, but all said and done, there's no doubt in my view that in the area of unleashing India's growth potential, which was the dominant thrust of the reforms to begin with, because it was felt that the system that we had was choking off our latent entrepreneurial instincts, etc. I think the reforms have been hugely successful. For a very long period between, I think, 2003 and maybe up to 2016, which actually spans over more than one government, but includes all of the UPA period, you had a growth rate which was sort of well over 7% per year on average, okay? And we've never had that before. Now, I think since then, there was a slowdown after 2016, and of course, right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is not a India-specific thing, it's a global thing. But there's no doubt that the reforms are what made it possible for India to be regarded as one of the faster-growing emerging market countries. That's the first point. Second is, there was a lot of criticism at the time that the reforms would not actually help the poor. And I think the evidence we have suggests that criticism was not valid. Between something like 2004 and 2011, that's the only period for which we have data on what happened to poverty. There's a big reduction in the absolute number of people below the poverty line. And I attribute that to the fact that the reforms tried to unleash a growth process which also emphasized the sectoral content of that growth, because agriculture was regarded as a very critical area that we should focus on. And also, policies put in place included a number of initiatives aimed at helping the small producer, the poor, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee, etc. Schemes that were meant to improve the income levels of those at the bottom of the spectrum. So I think on the basic question that was this not something which also helped the poor, I would say it was. Now, mind you, the whole thing has got distorted in the last year globally, because in the last year, there's a huge amount of concern about the rise of inequality. Now, inequality may have been going up during the development process. I mean, some of that is actually unavoidable. But the critical question is not whether inequality was going up, but whether the poor were benefiting enough. And I think all the evidence we have suggests that lots of people at the lower end of the spectrum benefited. Of course, over time, one can always say that we needed to do more. I would say the big area of disappointment on the reform process are really twofold. I don't think we did as well as we should have in human development, by which I really mean health and education. There are many reasons for that, and we can go into those, but Although in the case of education, this was both in the case of health and in the case of education, this was recognized somewhere during the UPA period that we need to do something more. And certainly the putting more money into primary education, that was done. But I think what we found in education is that putting more money isn't enough. I mean, you can put the money, but you don't actually get the results in terms of better quality education. I think in the case of health, we haven't even put the money. And one of the big reasons for that really is that, in a way, both education and health are state subjects. They're not central government subjects. In the case of education, the central government went out of its way to create a channel to support primary education in the states. In the health sector, it didn't do that. And as a result, I mean, in terms of the expenditure, the public expenditure that we incur on health is much below what it should be. But the real question is that most of that should be done by state governments. So there's a lack of clarity now that if state governments don't do this, should central government do more? I mean, you can take whichever view you want. But I think those are clearly areas where I would have hoped that 30 years after the reforms began, we would have shown a better result. More recently, I think there is an awareness that environment is something that we need to be much more concerned about. Now, you know, we've always been concerned about it in terms of having the right slogans, but how to integrate, how to evolve a development policy which actually integrates a sensible environmental protection policy, I think this is still an open challenge. And mind you, with the threat of climate change all over the world, this has become a major challenge facing not just us, but virtually all developing countries. And it's now quite urgent. It's, because you can see that global warming, if that continues, is going to have a very damaging effect. And what's more, we are going to be one of the worst affected. So those are big areas to which policy should now address itself.
Right. Were these some areas that you think that could have been addressed before and have been left unaddressed? Like you mentioned, health, education, or steps that have been...
Yeah, I mean, I think in the area of the central government, I feel that, you know, we should have done more in building the kind of infrastructure that Indian industry needs in order to be competitive, which would have meant more investment. We started during the UPA period to recognize that, you know, the public sector doesn't have the money. So we should bring in more public-private partnership. And we did that. And there were lots of success stories. But somehow that ran into obstacles of different kinds. And I think we still have to overcome those obstacles. You know, let me say that when you do something different, it's not as if when you do the reform, you anticipate everything. You indicate a broad direction. You say, look, let's get on with it. Then there will be problems. Then when the problems arise, they should get fixed. And I think that I don't believe there's any alternative to having much more public-private partnership if you want to build infrastructure. But I think we need to also develop the environment in which public-private partnership can work. And one of the big issues there is dispute resolution. You know, most private sector guys feel that although we call it public-private partnership, we don't view it as a partnership. I mean, once the thing starts, we view the other side with deep suspicion. And they very often come back and say, look, we agreed to this for the next 30 years, but you know, that's lots of things have happened, so it has to be modified. And in our system, I don't blame the civil servants. It's very difficult for the civil servants to modify something in a manner that might look as if you're favoring the private partner. The private partner says, look, if it's reasonable and we are partners, why can't you do it? Now, I think we can do it, but it can't be done by the officials who are directly dealing on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, I think Vijay Kelkar was asked, when the government changed, Vijay Kelkar was asked to prepare a report on how do we handle dispute resolution. I think that report is available, and we need to implement some of those proposals.
Right. So, the new industrial policy that you brought in 1991 that kind of eased a lot of the requirement for permits for industries was there was a way of which industries could flourish. But still, manufacturing somehow seems to have lagged. Services industry has done well, but the manufacturing sector still remains far from competitive compared to, their international peers. Why do you think that is?
Well, this is a general statement that is lagged. It has not grown as rapidly as we wanted it to. Okay. And I think the only way it could have grown that rapidly is if we had had an equally rapid growth in manufactured exports. Because in all the success stories of East Asia, the rapid growth of manufacturing has not been led by the growth of domestic demand. It's been led by piggybacking on global markets. And I think we did not do that, and particularly in the labor-intensive areas. And there are many reasons for that, but I certainly think that what a lot of economists and a lot of industrialists also say is that the labor laws that we had did not encourage people to go into labor-intensive areas. Now, this is a very controversial issue. I mean, there are many economists who will tell you that this is all nonsense and this is just an attempt to erode labor rights, etc., etc. But the point is, if you're competing in those days with China, we're not competing with China anymore, they're too far ahead, but Vietnam now, Bangladesh, all these countries have greater labor flexibility. And we didn't, and I think that discouraged our people, our industrialists from going into labor-intensive areas. That's point number one. Point number two is that, many critical infrastructure areas, in particular the provision of power at reasonable rates, I don't think we're all that good. I mean, our power supplies are very uncertain. People have to use their own generators. When they're getting supply, it's at very high rates because it's cross-subsidizing other consumers. I mean, this is to my mind, self-imposed limitations on the country's competitiveness, which are unfortunate. I would also say that, our procedures for clearing things and all the rest of it, the whole logistics chain in India doesn't work very well. And this has all been well known. Everything can't be changed at one go. But with a determined effort, we can actually improve this over time quite a bit. But let me say that in certain areas, I mean, manufacturing was competitive. I mean, for example, auto components, they did very well. I mean, today, Indian two-wheelers are doing quite well abroad. Indian pharmaceuticals have done quite well abroad. So the notion that Indian manufacturing is not competitive, I think what has happened is that our system has encouraged our manufacturers to go into the high skill intensive and high capital intensive areas. They've positively discouraged them from going into the labor intensive, low skill areas, which is where a lot of growth could have taken place, but that growth would have required them to be export competitive. And I think we're not export competitive. I mean, even today we are too willing to raise protective walls against Indian industry to protect Indian industry. That's not a strategy for gaining export competitiveness.
Right. So that's the whole our government's Atmanirbhar push, right? The kind of custom duties and import duties that have come in.
Yes, I think that is it's a recent trend in the sense in the last 3 or 4 years. We have raised our customs duties, by the way, were already much higher than other countries. In fact, the previous several regimes, beginning with 91, but then continuing into the Narasimha Rao, into the United Front government, continuing into the Vajpayee government, they all said we must bring duties down to East Asian duty levels, and that had not yet been done. Actually, even within the current government's time, the Niti Aayog, one of the first reports that Niti Aayog produced under the vice chairmanship of Arvind Panagria, a very distinguished trade economist, I mean, he made the point that we must yes, he endorsed the trend that we must keep lowering our customs duties. But I mean, we've not done that. We've raised those customs duties.
Right. So you mentioned labor reforms. This government has brought in many of these four labor codes. How do you think this government has done on the reforms front? What are the big reforms that still need to be done?
Well, I think one of the things about the labor codes is that they're still not notified. I don't know why that is so. Maybe there are some glitches, but we do know what the broad reforms are. And I think that this consolidation of the codes and having a single definition, these are good things. And I mean, they should be done. But let me say that on the very limited issue of flexibility, I think the main thing that the reforms do is that they allow people to hire contract labor, okay, over a much wider range, but they do not give flexibility to affect your permanent labor force, except for raising the limit from 100 employees to 300 employees. That's not a lot of flexibility because remember, it was 300 employees in 1983. In 1983, Mrs. Gandhi's government, in an effort to appear to be pro-employment, lowered that limit to 100 so that anybody who had employees more than 100 would not be able to get rid of them without the approval of the government. Earlier it was 300. We haven't yet gone back to 300 in the national code, although some individual states have adjusted it, some, okay? Frankly, if you want competitiveness in labor using industry, you need to have flexibility for people who are hiring 5,000 workers. And what you need is to grant that flexibility in a sensible way, which enables them to vary their labor force on certain conditions so that they don't mind taking on a large labor force. I don't think we've done that yet. So that part of it still remains outside the realm of possibility. I realize, by the way, that there's almost no political party that's willing to do that. I mean, somehow all our political parties have got fixated on the idea that introducing flexibility in hiring amounts to hire and fire and is anti-labor. And at least half the economists actually endorse that view. So I don't blame the political leaders for being concerned. But I think we have to recognize that it's not hire and fire. You can have a series of proposals that will enable people to adjust labor, but if they're expanding subsequently, they have to give first option to the people who they've earlier got rid of it. Things like that would enable businesses to become more flexible and yet allow labor to move around. And I think we're not there yet, at least on this. I think the other, we've already mentioned the regression on customs duties, which I think is very unfortunate. My own view is that we made a mistake by not joining RCEP. I mean, this is as much geopolitical as an economic decision. But if the name of the game is to integrate with global supply chains, and that, by the way, is what the government says. I mean, the government does not say that Atmanirbhar is a protectionist policy. I mean, they say it's a way of making India great and strong, which is good. I mean, nobody can object to that. The government also says that we want to integrate with global supply chains. Now, frankly, if you want to integrate with global supply chains, you need to bring your duty levels down to the duty levels in other countries which are integrating with global supply chains. And quite frankly, I think we should have joined RCEP. After all, Asia is the most prosperous region in the world. It's the most open region in the world. This is the region where people are not resorting to protectionism. And the Prime Minister himself had said we want to move from look east to act east. I think that's right. So why have we not acted east on RCEP? I think industry lobbying has misled the government into not recognizing that it is in the national interest for us to do this. I know that a lot of people will say that, China is a member of RCEP, and we would then be giving a lot of concessions to China. Let's face it, if China is soon to become the largest economy in the world, in an integrated global economy, you will be competing with China directly or indirectly. So I think, and RCEP gave us a lot of time to lower our duty levels to withstand competition. And the main case that Indian industry has traditionally made is that, look, we don't mind facing up to competition, providing you give us the right environment and foundational support. I agree with that view entirely. But we had enough time to do that. I mean, we didn't have to reduce our duties except over several years. So frankly, joining RCEP would have put pressure on the system to give Indian industry a fair deal. The trouble with protectionism is it completely removes that pressure. Because if Indian industry says, I'm not competitive, you're just going to say, well, let's raise your duty. And you'll do that for every single person who comes, and you'll end up somewhere close to where you were in 1991.
So this really brings back, or is a step back in the way or what in 1991 reforms envisaged.
On the trade side, actually, it does. I think the American philosopher, I think it was George Santayana, who said that, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So I'm really glad that people like you are going back to 1991 and making people aware of what a ridiculous system we were running. You could legitimately criticize people then that why didn't you do it earlier and why didn't you do it faster? I agree with that. I'm not a great believer, by the way, in what they call big bang reforms, that you go there and change everything. But you know what, where we are now, 30 years after the reforms, we should have been there 15 years ago. We were too slow. Okay, we're running a democracy, so that's the cost of democracy. But there's no justification for regression unless you genuinely believe that this is going to be better. And if that is so, that should be debated. And after all, I mean, the first report out of Niti Aayog endorsed that view. So I'm not sure, is it just industry lobbying that has changed this policy? I don't know.
Right. So you talked about how, what we could have achieved this in 15 years. Where did India go wrong?
Well, I don't like the going wrong. You can always, let's put it this way, whatever you do, you can do better.
Okay.
And I would say that, let me mention two things where I think we should have done more. And at different times we had the option, but somehow we held back. One of them is banking sector reform. In 1991, one of the important things that was done was banking sector reforms. And it was done in a very sensible way. It wasn't just unveiled as these are reforms. These other things, industrial policy, trade policy, they had been discussed before. Banking sector reforms had generally not been discussed before. And what Dr. Manmohan Singh, as the finance minister, did was that he set up a top-class expert committee under Mr. M. Narasimhan, bringing in a whole lot of people from outside, saying, look, how do we modernize India's banking system? They laid out an entire spectrum of options. We started following those initiatives. In 1997, you had the East Asian crisis. And the East Asian crisis was widely regarded as having been precipitated by a very weak banking system. So we set up the second Narasimhan Committee to learn from the East Asian crisis, what is it that we should do? Now, one of the fundamental things that has come out from all this is that the excessive control that the central government and the Ministry of Finance has over public sector banks is very damaging to the economy. Now, this could be a controversial subject, but I think we need to address it head on. Lots of people have said that we need to we need to recognize that public sector banks in which the finance ministry exercises excessive control are not conducive to efficient banking. You can disagree with this if you like, but I think one should look at that and come to a conclusion. I happen to believe that the present system, which has been there ever since the banks were nationalized, is wrong and should be changed. It's not just me who's saying this. I mean, Yashwant Sinha, when he was finance minister under Vajpayee's government, way back in, I think it was in 1998, Narasimhan committee had said that, look, we should start reducing the government. So he said, yeah, I want to reduce the government stake down to 33% or something like that. You know, if the government went down to 33%, it would still be able to exercise strategic control over the banks, but it would not have the right, it would not be able to continually manipulate the banks on a day-to-day basis with the finance ministry giving directions here, there, and everywhere. Okay? He said that in Parliament, but his party did not back him and he had to back off. Okay? Certainly in the Congress party, there was nobody willing to do that either. So both the BJP and the Congress are not willing to have the government walk out of public sector banks. I mean, the result is what you're seeing. The performance of the public sector banks, let's face it, is much worse than the performance of the private sector banks. And what's happening is the share of banking, which is being controlled by private sector, is going up. That's good. We are allowing the private sector to expand. But, you know, we've got the public sector banks have their hands tied behind their backs. So it's like saying we are willing to see the sector privatized, but we're not willing to let any public sector bank be privatized. I think that's wrong. And I think that's something that all the governments that have been in power can take equal blame for.
True, sir. Too many reports, too many recommendations, too many...
No, I don't agree with you at all. It's not too many reports. It's the same recommendation over and over again.
But not implemented.
It is look, it's the fundamental point really is this, that if you're talking to someone from the finance ministry, I'm not referring to the present, any government, and you ask them, are you adding any value to the public sector banks? Do they say yes or do they say no? I mean, those who are currently in the ministry will always say yes. But those who have left the ministry, they'll be much franker and tell you no. Look, I don't think people realize that at the moment, the Reserve Bank of India does not have the same regulatory power over public sector banks that it has over private sector banks. In the case of the private sector banks, if it finds that the chief executive is not a suitable person, the RBI can remove him or her because they feel that he's not doing a good job or she's not doing a good job. In the case of the public sector banks, they can't do that. I see no reason for that, really. And if you were to give the RBI the same regulatory power, the RBI's own sense of responsibility would become immense. At the moment, all they have to do is write a letter to the finance ministry saying we're not happy at this, and that's the end of the story. So they've got a alibi, That's not the way to do things, in my view.
So what do you think of the government's move to now at least start the process of privatizing two banks? Though we have seen with IDBI, it was an entirely different process. But what do you think with this fresh move that they're talking about privatizing another two state-owned banks?
No, I am in favor of selecting some banks and privatizing them. Selling these banks to other public sector enterprises is not privatization. That's for sure. Or selling them to LIC, but I don't call that privatization. That's just it's like instead of taking LIC money into the budget directly, it's like doing it in this way. And I'm not sure that the banks improve by being owned by LIC. There's no evidence that LIC knows anything about banking. So why would it be any different? But if they genuinely decide to privatize, I think that's a good move. Let's see if they do. I mean, Between announcing a privatization and getting it done is a very big step. And one of the problems in privatizing banks is always the conditions that you impose. I mean, for example, all public sector banks are massively overstaffed. So if you impose a condition that you can't fire anybody, you're not going to get much of a bid.
Right. So, what do you think of the current government's handling of the pandemic and its economic impact? What are your thoughts on?
Well, I think I'm not an expert on epidemiology, so I'm not sure in handling the pandemic whether they could have done it better or not. I think, to be fair, one should recognize that this pandemic is not just an Indian phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. And all over the world, I mean, experiences have varied. I mean, some countries seem to have done well and then suddenly start doing badly. So and this was a pandemic on which there was no rule book. So I would not pronounce on whether some things I think we could have done a lot better. Like, I mean, all the mass migration, suddenness of lockdown. But those things, those are parts of the whole picture. The overall management of the pandemic has hit us very badly. There was a period when we went around saying that, look, we've done exceptionally well. That has totally been reversed because the second surge, I mean, really took our infection levels through the roof. Now it's coming down again. On the impact, there, I think, again, it's been negative. Many people think that the negative, when the full facts come out, will be shown to be more than the official data claim. I suspect that we should have done more by way of fiscal countermeasures. We took a lot of measures to handle the pandemic, but most of those were monetary measures. I think other countries also did a lot of monetary measures. So I don't have any criticism of the monetary policy that the Reserve Bank followed, which is just to loosen up everywhere. And you take a bit of a risk on inflation. Initially, that was the right thing to do. I personally think that we were a little too preoccupied with protecting the fiscal deficit, whereas I think we should have recognized much earlier that, look, this is an exceptional situation. The growth is we're not going to get anything like the growth rate we talked about. It's going to be negative. But, we were not willing to accept that growth is going to be negative until much later. I mean, I don't think the finance ministry made any estimate revising its own budget estimates. But many official spokesmen said, well, it'll be plus 1%, whereas actually it's ended up, according to official data, minus 7.3. And some people say it could be worse. But I think we need to look forward. I mean, whatever this year has been bad for many, many countries, developing countries, etc. The real question is, what are we going to do from now onwards, and what are the most important things to focus on? And that's, I think, what we should concentrate on. And in my view, there are many. I mean, if you made a list of reforms at any time, you can make 100. I mean, if you call up any ministry, they always have 10 reforms that they've been thinking about. So any government that wants to make a list of 100 reforms can very easily make them. See, the name of the game is they're all good reforms, and remember, we're not a developed country. We haven't reached where we want to be. We are just the bottom of the we're the lower end of the middle income category. We just got out of low, the bottom of the middle. So many, many things need to be done and need to be reformed. I think we have to ask the question of all these things. What are the 5 or 6 things that we need to fix now, which will give a new, renewed burst of economic growth? And that's really what I hope the government will concentrate on.
Right. But, in the absence of data relating to employment, the absence of data relating to poverty, how exactly will these kind of policy-making measures really work? Because You don't really know what's happening on the ground.
No. Let me put it this way. We do know. You have data on employment from the CMIE. We don't yet have the official data. As far as growth is concerned, we know that the national accounts growth data assumes that the informal sector grow at the same rate as the formal sector. We know that the formal sector is doing much better than the informal, and the informal was hit much more. It follows, therefore, that that particular assumption would lead to an unduly positive picture on the growth front. Doesn't matter. I mean, that's not the key thing. The key thing is that, and it's not a question of measuring poverty and so on. I mean, look, if growth went down to 7.3% negative, and during this period, population would have increased by about 1.2 or something like that. So therefore, per capita income we know is down by something like 8.5%. So we know that if per capita income is down 8.5% and the informal sector is hit more, we know that poverty has gone up. We may not have a number, but there's no doubt that poverty. But the key thing is this: the most important thing at the moment is to revive the growth. I think a lot of people looking at this data tend to sort of come to the conclusion, oh, this is terrible, the poor have been hit, you people are only concerned about growth, you should worry about the poor. You should worry about the poor. But the way to worry about the poor is, for God's sake, let's get the growth back. When you've got the growth back, you can still say that, this is good, but it doesn't help this person and it doesn't help this group. So the single most important thing to do is to bring the economy back to where it was in 2019-20, which is what the hope is this year will happen. The next most important thing is what's happening to investment. It's only if private investment recovers that we're going to get back to a reasonable growth rate, unless you take the view that it doesn't matter if private investment doesn't recover, we'll do it through public investment. Now, we've seen that movie before. There's a lot of role, in my view, while private investment is depressed, to run a bigger fiscal deficit and put the money in infrastructure. And later on, we can sell off this infrastructure to the private sector if we want. But in the end, the name of the game must be, how do we revive the private sector's spirits and its ability to invest? I think for that, a much healthier banking system is absolutely crucial. So we need to put the banking system back on its feet. And there are many areas which again are difficult. Like, for example, I think one of the most important reforms which this government has done was the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Economists had for long said we needed to have it. They brought it in. It's now run into all kinds of problems. Because of the pandemic, the processing under this IBC was interrupted. Now there's a lot of questions about, how is it going to move forward? Some people are saying, well, look, resolution involves a large haircut. That's unavoidable in the sense that, given the situation, what's the solution? Is the solution that we allow these things to continue indefinitely, or we take the plunge and do what we can? So I think getting the IBC back into operation is a very important element of reform that we should be concentrating on. Like getting the banking system back in good shape is very important.
Right. And just because this is in the news right now, how do you think this whole controversy and the government's decision to continue pursuing arbitration in the Vodafone and Kane cases, how does it impact foreign investment? How does it impact India's image as an investor-friendly country?
Yeah, I think, look, it has a very negative impact. You have to make a distinction. You can't complain about a government pursuing a case, in the sense that if they have the legal option to appeal something and they decide to appeal it, you can't object to that. Because the great thing about international arbitration is that if there is a legal option, it will be considered, and very quickly there will be a decision. The real question is, at the end of it all, if the case goes against the government, what should the government do? Now, in my view, it's very clear that when we enter into these arbitrations, we enter into them on the clear understanding that we will go through the full due process, but in the end, we'll abide by the decision. Otherwise, we're making a mockery of the whole thing. So I don't know what the government will do, but if all it's done is examining whether it can appeal the Cairns decision, okay, I mean, unlike appeals in India, which can take 20 years, it will be very clear whether there is scope for appeal or not. So then the question is, if there's no more scope for appeal, and this is the final thing, what will the government do? I don't know, but my view on this would be we should accept the end result.
Right.
I mean, the alternative, the word that will go around is that if you ever have a dispute with the government of India, there is no fair way of resolving the dispute because the government will never accept anything that goes against it. Now, if that becomes an established principle, it will be very damaging for India. And I hope that whatever the government does, it looks at it from that point of view.
Right. And so my last question, do you think the Modi government should employ more technocrats for better handling the economy?
I think I'm not a great believer in what is the definition of a technocrat. I mean, I think we should judge a government by the policies. If the policies are being produced by bureaucrats or technocrats, I can think of innumerable technocratic systems which have produced disastrous results and innumerable non-technocratic systems that have produced very good results. So I don't think the solution lies in that issue. As a general rule, of course, there's a relevant question whether government should be more open to bring in people from outside, and I think that they should be, and I think they are. I mean, they have brought in some people from outside. But I don't think it's a technocrat versus non-technocrat issue. I think it's a question of judging. Policies should be, in my view, constantly subjected to critical scrutiny, both from within the government and outside the government. Outside the government, of course, is always the case, but it should also be done inside the government. And if that is done, when something is found to be not right, the policy should be modified.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for speaking to us. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.